In our first unit, we were really concerned with the origins of the short story. And those origins were mainly founded in the oral tradition, myths, legends, parables, fairy tales, and folklore. And all of that contributes to what we consider to be the short story that we so lovingly um, turn to today. And the short story actually becomes this kind of cultural phenomenon in the 19th century. Between the 16th and 18th century, the decline in short fiction happens. A lot of these stories that we have been reading, or tales or origin stories or what have you, were written prior to the 16th. And I'd argue that you can look at the folklore and fairy tales that we talked about last week as part of the 17th century, but I digress. There is a decline in this kind of popularity of short fiction. And that's primarily due to, that's primarily due to, in the 16th century, of course, we have this fascination with drama and Shakespeare and those types of things. We also have this belief in poetry as the superior literary art form. And poetry meaning these long, digressive epics, looking at things like Paradise Lost and other types of long poetic verse. And then in the 18th century, of course, with the Age of Reason and the Age of Enlightenment, we get this emphasis on nonfiction types of works like journalism, and sermons, essays, anything that kind of diverted against fiction and aided in knowledge and enlightenment, or the spread of information, if you will. And then finally, at the end of the 18th century, early 19th centuries, particularly in England, we have the emergence of the novel as a genre. And prior to the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, the novel wasn't a thing. And I don't want to go too much on a digression because I love the emergence of the novel as a genre. But the novel wasn't a thing, and it explodes during the 19th century. And that's where we have, especially in England, this attraction to the great Victorian novel or the Regency novel. I mean, look at things like, Pride and Prejudice, Jane Eyre, writers like Dickens and other novelists that I won't mention. But there is this, it's this fascination and draw to the novel. So in we have this decline in short fiction, and while across the pond in England everyone is flocking to the novel as this new literary art form, in America we have a new kind of emphasis in the short story, or the cultural phenomenon that is the short story. It also finds footing in Germany, Russia, and France, but the short story is by and large an American thing. And America, as you know, during the late 18th century, early 19th century, is just a baby that has been born, and with that comes the short story. So there are two facets or two strains of short stories in the 19th century. One is the regionalists, where they focus on giving some sort of realism. I mean, it has to have, it could be possible to happen in real life. There's this emphasis on creating a slice of reality or verisimilitude. The other is impressionistic. And the impressionist story is a tale shaped and given meaning by the consciousness or psychological attitudes of the narrator. And predicated upon this element of subjectivity, these stories seem less objective and are less realistic in the outward sense. In other words, meaning is given by the attitudes of the narrator. We'll be reading both styles of short stories this unit and throughout into the next unit. But three of the big heavy hitters that are responsible for creating what we see as the modern short story are, and two we're going to discuss this week, Poe we'll talk about next week, and we'll talk about another one next week too, are Washington Irving, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Edgar Allan Poe. And arguably, a lot of people see Edgar Allan Poe as the quintessential kind of forefront of the short. I mean, he's the most famous short story writer of them all, right? You've all heard of him. But I would argue that the title of the father of the short story goes to this guy right here, Washington Irving, because what happens is prior to the 1800s, American literature was heavily influenced by European, especially British writers. We didn't really have an identity of our own. And a lot of the literature and the movements that happen in England happen in America, except 50 years apart, because there's that kind of dissonance. But anyways, I am digressing. But with the short story and Washington Irving, we get an American kind of genre and an American culture. And like I said, none of that would happen without Washington Irving. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to pick up and I'm going to give you guys a little bit of information about Washington Irving. We're going to talk about the background of The Devil and Tom Walker. And then I'll probably stop, pick up with Hawthorne and Young, Dim, and Brown. So hang with me and I'll be back.